morning, everybody. Welcome back to those of you who've been to these CBI at 10 webinars before, and welcome if it's your first one. It's great to be here this morning. We're joined by Ray Newton-Smith, who's the Chief Economist of the CBI, by Charlene Lyons, who's the Chief Executive of the incredibly wonderful and amazing Black Sheep Brewery up in Masham in the gorgeous Yorkshire Dales, which I was saying before the call that was the site of both my dad and my brother's stag do's, for which I'm very grateful and sorry for any damage that was caused. And Andy Brown, who is the Group Corporate Affairs Director of Manchester Airport Group. Thank you so much for making the time to be with us this morning. We're going to have a quick trot around sort of this week's latest developments on how the government is handling the pandemic, on how we're doing in the UK, particularly looking at the vaccine rollout plan. We were just discussing before we started that this is going well. We find ourselves in a position with some good news to talk about, which is nice. And then we're going to have a proper deep dive into the CBI budget submission and to look at some of the new measures that the CBI is lobbying the government for to put in place to support businesses for the first half in particular of this year, and then looking further ahead as well. As always, if you would like to ask a question to the panel, you can do that. Put it in the questions function that you can see. If you want to ask a question anonymously, you can do that too, and we will filter out and ask as many of those to the panel as we possibly can during the course of the next 45 minutes or so. My name is Liz Mosley and I'm from Tortoise, and we're going to open the bidding this morning with Rain, if we can. Good morning, Rain. Nice to see you. Thank you for being here.
Good morning, Liz.
Let's talk about vaccines, if we can, because as I say, it feels unusual to me as a journalist who's covered the pandemic for sort of 9 months or so to have something, a good news story, but particularly a good news story about the UK in an international context. This seems to be going well, or have I misunderstood?
No, I think it's absolutely a shining beacon of light in terms of our overall COVID response, and I think it's something we all sorely need at the moment. We started the week with Blue Monday, whether you think that's a thing or not. I think we do know from talking to businesses and just from friends and family how tough it is for everyone at the moment, and the strains on people's mental health, whether you're homeschooling or whether you're home alone and dealing with all the isolation that brings. I think one of the number one concerns that businesses have at the moment is supporting the mental health of their employees, and we know the pandemic is affecting all of us around them, friends who have the disease, who are self-isolating. It's just such a really tough time for everyone. But I think, the real positives around us is the vaccine rollout, and you can see everyone's spirits get lifted when you hear of someone who's had the vaccine. My mother-in-law has had it. I have friends in the NHS have had it, and it really does lift our spirits. And I think, look, internationally, we are in such a good place. We really, that vaccine rollout is really happening. We've already had 4 million people who've had that first dose. So it's really quite phenomenal, and almost 500,000 have received their second dose. And what we do know is, all importantly, that first dose, provides some really important immunity in the coming months, which is obviously the critical period. And we have all the large-scale vaccine rollout. So I think that, it's such a beacon of light. And I think the other thing that, and this may come in through some of the discussions, what's really important is, if you take alongside our ability with the vaccine, our ability to alter the vaccine and the strength of our rollout, that's really important, not just for now, but for how this pandemic might evolve, different strains of the virus, because we're also very strong on our ability to identify different strains. And so I think that puts us in a really strong position, not just for where we are now, but in the coming years, either from this pandemic or from something else. So I think it is such an important beacon of light.
Yeah, agree. And the sort of one of the other key pillars that has been less successful is around testing. That's crucial for businesses, both live now in terms of how people are operating, and also when we sort of ease into, opening up, hopefully, sort of in the springtime. Where are we at with testing now? What's the mood music on that?
Well, I think, look, there have absolutely been challenges. I think with the test and trace system, and I think some of that has sometimes been just overwhelming. The capacity has been absolutely overwhelmed as the infection rates have got higher. But I think what's positive is when we've now that we can match that with some of the lateral flow testing. I think that is really important, and the government is now working with businesses to think about how we roll out some of that within the workplaces. And actually, next Monday we've got Dido Harding coming along to our webinar, so that's a critical time we can go through all of those issues, because I think it will be really important in the not just the coming months, but beyond,
Yeah.
as an important part of our arsenal.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. I think definitely Dido is the woman to ask the questions to on the testing front. Let's get on to a sort of, I think you call it a bifocal lens in the budget submission, because we've got this. There's a sort of date on the 3rd of March, obviously, when the Chancellor is going to make the budget as normal, which is sort of known date in the diary. And some we talked about last week as well. There's a sort of cliff edge on some of the support packages and a hockey stick in terms of some of the costs and the payback of some of those loans and things like that, that is coming at businesses like a train. And in the budget submission, there's a sort of two-way timelines operating together. There's the real near-term pinch points, and then there's a sort of package of recommendations for the long term, talking about the nature of the recovery. It can be hard to think about the long term when today is so tough. So let's try and do sort of both of those things if we can. Just give us a sense of what's in the submission, and then we'll go into each of the bits in turn.
Absolutely, and I think one of the other things I might start with as well is just one of the other near-term pressures on businesses. I think it is worth mentioning is also around Brexit. And now we have the deal,
Yeah.
but we know there are still issues at the border. So I think that's something I wanted to say we are really picking up from members some of the challenges they're still facing at borders. And one of the manufacturers who is vital to some of our supply chains was sort of saying every day matters, because they're still facing challenges in terms of lorry traffic going through Ashford and some of our other critical ports. And I think one of the challenges there, and what I think the message to government is, there are some known issues. The issues are resolvable, but we really need to focus on that. So that's something we're absolutely working with. We're feeding into Michael Gove's weekly task force and conversations with Kwasi Kwarteng, the new business secretary, and many. And it's really about making sure we have the right practical guidance for business, keeping those borders open and flowing. Where we notice there are specific issues, feeding that intelligence into government, so they can do what they can to fix some of those issues, and of course ensuring that we build on the deal we already have and improve the sort of access. But look, that's one thing that businesses are dealing with. I think actually the biggest challenge for businesses across the spectrum has absolutely been managing COVID. And I am so delighted to be joined by Andy and Charlene. I haven't had the pleasure of being at the brewery, but actually Manchester Airport was one of the last places I went and did a presentation to Andy and some of his colleagues about back in February last year. I dread to think what I might have said about what was going to happen to the economy that year, because it was pre the pandemic really taking a hold. But I think both of their businesses have really been impacted, and there's been a lot of focus as well on support for businesses that have physically had to close their doors. But one of our real messages to the Chancellor is we need to think about the supply chains. I know they will go, but if you're a brewer supplying the pub, you are as impacted as that pub that has to shut the doors. And airports are so critical for our connections with the world, but also our exports as well. And it's just such an important part of our critical infrastructure. So we really need to make sure that we're doing all we can to support. So I think our message to the Chancellor is absolutely, you need to act quickly. You need to target the support that is available at sectors that are deeply affected and their supply chains. And you need to smooth the cliff edge in support, because at the end of March and April, there's a series of government support schemes that come to come to an end. So first and foremost, the job retention scheme, such a lifeline for so many people, that's set to come to an end in the end of April. And what we're saying is that needs to stay in place in its current form till the end of June. We know businesses are having to plan on a whole range of scenarios as to how this pandemic and the restrictions will be lifted. And I
We
think
need to
there
know that soon, though. We need an answer from the Chancellor. We can't. March the 3rd is too late.
exactly, and that's our sort of main message. Look, I think that the budget will still stand. There's important things and decisions that will be have to make about long-term spending decisions, long-term reform to taxation. But we really need to see action before the 3rd of March, because businesses are planning now for the next 6 months, for the next year, and they can't afford to wait until the 3rd of March to find out what will happen to a scheme that's so fundamental to their business that's set to come to an end on current policy at the end of April. And I think that what's also important is we don't then want a cliff edge in that support at the end of June. So our message is you then need to have some way of gradually reducing the support that is available post-June, either targeting it more by sector or increasing the contributions from employers, but making it open to all businesses. And that's a really important decision the Chancellor has to make. And I think we need to have more information on that, and you know, I think we're pretty clear about what we think the direction of travel is.
Great, thanks ever so much, Rain. It's a really good introduction. I'm going to pick up, if I can now, I'll come back to you with, I'm going to go to Andy. Well, before we leave Brexit behind completely, and as we get into the sort of current package of measures, and particularly talking about targeted support, obviously aviation is a very challenged sector. We were talking before about what it's like inside the airports that you represent, and it's extraordinary. There's a question come in from Nigel Dowler. How can Manchester Airport, as an example, operate financially currently? We've no idea whether airports have slashed costs, reinvented new revenue streams, or are digging into reserves. You know, there aren't any passengers. You know, I was asking you questions about how's the new testing requirement going. You're like, well, I'll let you know when someone gets on a plane. It's kind of, it's just a very different mode of being. Just to paint a picture for us of how your business is looking at the moment.
Yeah, I think I completely agree with what Rain was saying about some of the sectors that have been a bit overlooked. It feels in aviation like we are one of the very hardest hit over the course of this pandemic. In each of the national lockdowns, passenger numbers for us, so we have 3 airports, Manchester, London Stansted and East Midlands. Their passenger numbers have dropped to 1 or 2% of normal for the entire time that those very harsh lockdown restrictions have been in place. But even during the summer months when the least restrictive measures were in place in terms of travel, the recovery barely happened. We never beat more than 30% of our normal passenger numbers, even when travel corridors were in place that meant no quarantine or testing for all of our key markets. People just didn't travel during that time. So for the first 6 months of last year, up to September, we made a loss of more than £230 million before tax. Obviously, we're still looking at what goes on now, but there's no indication that the national lockdown will stop before the end of this financial year. So I'd be stunned if our passenger numbers beat more than 10% for this financial year. So to the question that's come in about how we're staying open, it is using things like the furlough scheme very aggressively. We've got more than 80% of our staff on furlough. But we have made the decision to do everything we can to keep our airfields operating, because there are some essential things that are going through airports. Rain talked about exports and freight. There are emergency services that use our airports, and we don't want to close if we can possibly avoid it, but it's extremely tough at the moment.
And did you have a sense of, we sort of opened with a rather optimistic or realistic but positive vaccine story at the moment. Do you have a sense of what are the milestones that would need to be hit in order for you to see your operation building back towards something like normality? Do you have a sense of that pathway and what the timeline might be for that?
Yeah, I think all travel and tourism companies are focused on the summer months. So we make almost all of our money. So it's really critical for us that we move as fast as the public health situation allows to make the best attempt at this summer. I'm encouraged by the milestones in the government's vaccination plan, and as Rain was saying, you know, we're doing well against that, and hopefully we will hit those targets of mid-February for the most vulnerable, Easter for the next chunk of vulnerable people. My concern is whether the government will be able to move quickly enough once they see that flowing through into reduced pressure on the NHS to move on relaxing those travel restrictions. I think at the moment we've got a very complicated network of measures in place that have been built up piecemeal over time. We are now actually, you look back over how this year's been, we've got the harshest travel restrictions in place now that we've had throughout all of this. 2 tests and a quarantine for all countries is just completely locked down all travel. I think we accept that that is the right thing to do. What we're nervous about is that the government has taken a lot of time to change their measures when they felt the time is right. They've been quite sluggish. And I don't think that we've got the time to do that if we're going to react quickly enough to save the summer. So I think sort of May, June, July will be critical for the sector. And we'll see companies then making some very difficult decisions at the back end of the summer if that summer hasn't performed well.
Yeah, thanks ever so much.
Sooner the better, basically. The more indication you can give businesses to plan for that time, the better.
I'm going to come back to you, Andy, when we get into some of the nuts and bolts of what the CBI, then they said the BBC, what the CBI is asking for in terms of targeted support, and what are the sorts of things in particular that would help your organisation. But I'm going to come to Charlene up there in Leeds. Morning, Charlene. It's lovely to see you. You're Chief Executive of the Black Sheep Brewery, and obviously there's, aviation has been hit, but the pubs are shut, and the pubs are, what did you say, 60% of your business, and that has gone, and it's remained gone. Did you see a bit of a bounce back?
Absolutely.
And you said, when life was a bit more normal in the summer, did you see a bit of a bounce back in that, or is it just?
So it's interesting. So you're right. Good morning, and thank you for having me, by the way. So 60% of our trade turned off overnight when pubs shut. Luckily, we were able to enforce change and react quickly because we're small. So we have a complete business model. We brew on site. We have our own fleet of vehicles. We sell to off trade and on trade, which is supermarkets and pubs. And we also have a small kind of retail division too. So we were able to make the best of a very bad situation and do a lot of things. For example, build an e-commerce business worth over £1 million from scratch. We were able to take advantage of the flexi furlough and the furlough scheme, which has been hugely beneficial. And we did a brew to you service, and we did an awful lot of things that we possibly could, but it does not go in any way to compensate for the loss of trade. And in July, it was really interesting actually, because I think everyone expected that pubs would just automatically reopen. That was not the case. A lot of people, a lot of pub operators didn't deem it to be commercially viable to open their doors because of the restrictions, because of the 2-metre distance, because of the number of covers that they could actually have in. So actually trade was quite depleted in a lot of areas. And also you've got to remember that for the majority, city centres were effectively closed. Go to Canary Wharf, go to Leeds City Centre, go to Manchester City Centre, it's empty. So a lot of pubs and restaurants have got no trade because it was after hours, if you know what I mean. People used to come for long boozy lunches. So it's been really, really challenging. And I think that also, for us as a business, we've had an awful lot of costs that people wouldn't necessarily be aware of. And I think that people forget that brewers are very different to pubs. We're not the same. Pubs have had support by way of grants and rate relief. Brewers haven't. And very early in the first lockdown, when things were obviously quite new to everybody, we were responsible for, along with all of the other national brewers, for collecting the beer from the supply chain. So we went to all of the pubs, all of the outlets, collected the unused beer, which clearly would go off. We disposed of it, and our responsibility was to replenish the supply chain when time allowed. That cost us over £250,000 at a time when we had a reduced income. So our GP is still significantly low. We have massive hopes for the remobilisation of pubs and brewing whenever time allows and when it's safe to do so, because pubs are really kind of part of the solution. They're not part of the problem. And I think that people have seen pubs as being the problem. We're no different to second-tier retail. We're no different to non-essential retail. It's the same. And I think that the support, and I know that some of the work that the CBI are doing needs to support, as we've said before, the supply chain in order to help us mobilise our business.
So would you like to see a more specific, the CBI submission does talk about supply chain as a sort of extension of the support. Would you like to see a more specific list out of what we mean by that, or do you think that is adequate to say, or let's not just think in terms of sectors, the sort of top layer, but everybody that feeds them as well?
I think it's absolutely vital to look at the supply chain. I mean, I often use the analogy of pizza restaurants. If you close every pizza restaurant in the UK but don't offer any support to the companies that supply pizza dough, they have no source of income. And it's the same for brewers. Only 8,000 pubs in the UK are linked to breweries. That's not an awful lot. So just because you're paying the pub a grant doesn't necessarily mean it translates to breweries. It doesn't. So yes, in terms of some of the support that we need as part of the supply chain, as Rain said, in addition to the flexi furlough, we need that to continue, because remobilising and reawakening the sector is going to take time. There are all sorts of other things that we can do. There's always a big debate around beer duty and whether or not that's fair. I mean, pubs and brewers contribute £22 billion per annum in terms of taxes. That's a huge amount of money. But is it fair to charge the same tax levy on draft beers to reawaken the pub sector versus bottle beers that are available in supermarkets? Could we do something with that? And that's all part and parcel of the support that the supply chain need. So I do think that we look at things differently and look at things in tiers. I think that's really, really important.
Okay, really useful. Thank you, Charlene. I'm going to come back to you in a second when we go through some of these more long-term sort of themes in the CBI budget submission. One in particular about upskilling you mentioned before, and the call I'd like to come back to you on. But Rain, if we can come back to you. So we talked about this sort of bifocal lens. There's a sort of near-term, next 6 months extension of furlough scheme, don't raise business taxes, these sort of package of measures. And then also the sort of submission looks further ahead as well, with a sort of 5-pillared approach, if you like, of asks. Would you just sort of unpack that a little bit for us, so we can have a think about how we might, get beyond the sort of real pinch points and into the world ahead?
Yeah, so absolutely. I think in the short term, our message to the Chancellor is we absolutely have to help as many businesses as possible survive through these really tough months. So that's extending the JRS. It's looking at VAT deferrals as well. That's one way of smoothing the cash flow pressures that are on business, taking it onto the government's balance sheet for a period of time, and then businesses, when they're back on their feet and growing, can repay that. So that's just a sort of liquidity issue to help alleviate the pressure. And then also looking at further targeted business rates relief to just try and help businesses with their fixed costs when demand is when restrictions and are in place and demand is so weak. But I think over the longer term, it's absolutely about, we want to see a recovery that's really sustainable, that is absolutely has our transition to a low carbon economy at the heart of it, but importantly is fueled by business investment. It can't just be household consumption and government spending that gets us through. We need to get businesses investing, growing, and creating jobs. And so I think in terms of that, one is actually looking at our business rate system and some more fundamental reforms. There are things that could be done around business rates, the rates that businesses pay on their property, to make it easier for businesses to make their property more energy efficient, for example, because at the moment the business rates system sort of penalizes you for doing that. So I think really grappling some of the long-standing reform issues that we know are important, and we've seen some of the impact on our high streets from this crisis. Secondly, it is that innovation and investment in the technologies that will help to make the move to a low carbon economy. That's where we need to have both public and private investment. So 7 new gigafactories, that's I'm never really sure. Gigafactories are basically battery storage. We know all that is happening in terms of electric vehicles. That relies on really important battery technology, but actually how we can store energy isn't just about cars. It's about the battery storage is such an important part of our low carbon transition. So that's one example where we need that investment, and the government has set up the National Infrastructure Bank, and again, that is a vehicle essentially for how you get public and private sector money into some of these newer technologies. So just supercharging that is so important. And then also helping SMEs to invest new digital technologies. We think there should be a scheme, Invest to Grow, where you are helping smaller businesses invest in some of the digital technologies they know they need, but it's harder to know how to get them, and they can be expensive. So it's a great opportunity for the government to have a scheme that really helps SMEs to adopt some of those digital technologies. And finally, it's about our human capital and how we invest in our people. I think wherever we are from here, I think unemployment, unfortunately, is likely to go up. So we need to think about this whole piece about adult retraining, how we help adults who maybe haven't had any significant training since they left high school. I think that, you know, a real focus on those people, and thinking about job centers. You know, they're so sort of old school and outdated. We need to think of them as digital skills hubs where you can go. You don't have to physically go into a building, but there is a great way of helping people who've been out of work for a period of time back into the workforce, understanding what jobs are available in their local area, what the opportunities are, and helping them get the skills they need to deliver. That's going to be so important for us as we emerge from this pandemic.
Thanks, Rain. So that if I sort of just replay them, there's the sort of the reforms and regulatory things that are sort of complicated and they're big league, and you know, things that will take time but need to happen. There's the invest to innovate. There's obviously the investment in upskilling and really sort of mobilizing the workforce in new and different ways, and then the continued push for net zero. None of those things are cost-free to do, and I just wonder if you can give a sense, and I'd love to hear from Charlene and Andy as well in their sort of microsystems. What is this government's sort of attitude to continuing to spend relative to paying back the debt that we've accrued just to sort of survive this year? There's a sort of energy debt, a spirit debt, if you like, because we're all exhausted and it's been so tough to get to this point. And then there's this sort of urgency and requirement to do all of these things that we want to do to describe that better future that we want. Do you have a sense of where the government's heads are at in terms of, oh my goodness, versus let's go?
I mean, maybe I'll just have a bit of a go from the sort of macro picture, and it'd be great to get Charlene and Andy's perspective.
Yeah.
But I think overall, you know, what we've seen is government debt has gone up, you know, in a way astronomically. We think, oh my goodness. But I think what's really important to bear in mind is actually the amount we're paying to service that debt is still relatively low, even historically, right? So I think we can tolerate a higher level of government debt. What we can't tolerate forever is the size of the government deficit, the sort of mismatch between government spending at the moment and tax receipts at the moment.
Yeah.
But I think what we also know is that once the economy is growing, it's growth that helps to drive revenues in, and then also naturally that means your spending comes down because there's more jobs, and some of the support the government needs to have in place will naturally fall away. So look, how is the government feeling? I think they are nervous, understandably, about the fiscal position. They do feel that whatever they do from now has to be very targeted, but I think we would urge them to finish the job on some of the COVID support. You know, they've invested so much so far in helping businesses survive. This is the last mile, and we really need to make that bridge to the recovery. And then I think on some of the other, you know, the other asks, in terms of investment, I think we do need to distinguish between things like physical infrastructure that pays a return over 30 years, 50 years. You know, what we do know from all the work around the move to a low carbon economy is the sooner you invest in those technologies, the sooner you see the benefits and the less you have to spend overall. So I think the government needs to take a really long-term perspective on the investment in, you know, making our homes more energy efficient. Over the life cycle of that investment, it pays for itself. But I think the government has to be very judicious in the decisions they make, and that's why I think the COVID support has to be really targeted, and we need to think about the exit strategy as well.
Yeah, thanks so much, Rain. I mean, when you say this really is the last mile, it makes me feel I really hope you're right. That's a really good sentence for me to write on the back of my hand and keep reading again and again and again. Andy,
exactly.
I'm going to come to you, because in the rebuilding of your business, there's a sort of very obvious pinch point, which is on the one hand, we all need a holiday. we definitely want to get back to the ability to sort of move around and experience the world and do all the things that air travel sort of facilitates us to be able to do. And yet we have to get to net zero, and that was already before all of this a sort of pressure point for the aviation industry. So do you have a sense of how your organisation, are you thinking about changing gear back into that sort of working towards carbon neutrality as well as building a sort of thriving business yet, or are you still in survival mode?
We absolutely think about that all the time. I think the whole aviation sector recognised before COVID-19 that sustainability was the nut that we had to crack. It's essentially our license to keep operating in this new net zero agenda that the country rightly has. MAG's pretty proud actually of its position in that. Our airports are already carbon neutral in terms of our operations. We've made a commitment to get to full net zero by 2038, quite a long way ahead of the 2050 target. But the important thing, of course, for aviation is less about the on-the-ground operations at the airports and more about the fuel being burned up in the sky. So we've been one of a number of really leading companies in that space in pushing towards, actually one of the last things we did before COVID really bit, was a UK aviation industry-wide commitment to net zero by 2050. I think I'm right in saying we're the first aviation sector in the world to make that commitment, that along with the rest of the economy, we will meet that same target. That's going to be really hard. There's a proper roadmap to get us there that uses a variety of measures, but there are some things that the government can do right now, and they're positive about investing in sustainable new fuels to replace the current fuel set, investing in new technology, and the government's really bought into that. We've set up the Jet Zero Council that government and industry together is working on, and I think that the COP26 conference at the end of the year will be really critical and a really good opportunity actually for the UK to make its stamp on the international stage about leadership in this space. So I think our head is very much still in crisis mode and trying to see our way out of this problem that we've got, but we're pretty confident that once the immediate pandemic issues are resolved, there is a clear and achievable path to get aviation to sustainability by the UK-wide target.
Thank you, Andy. And I can see Charlene's return. I know your Wi-Fi is a bit wobbly up in the morning, so I'm going to talk to you while you're there, just in case you disappear again. I was very particularly thought about, I don't know if it's because I'm from the part of the world where your business is based, but I was particularly taken with the way you were talking about your team. You know, your chief executive that has a sort of team to look after. It's very, very tough. And I can't tell if Charlene's frozen still or if she's still there. I hope she's still there. The upskilling is a critical part of the longer term view that the CBI is talking about. Lots of the people that work with you at Black Sheep are young. Obviously, we've talked about how are your team is the first question. And the second question is, what are the sorts of support packages that could come from the government that would help with that upskilling, retraining, remobilizing agenda to sort of keep people looked after? I suppose particularly, but not only for the younger people on your team.
Okay, sorry about my internet, by the way. I've got 3 children upstairs schooling, which is a challenge of COVID in itself. I think the reality is that people's morale is low. I mean, for the majority of our staff, as Andy said, over 80% of our workforce are on furlough. So by the time they come back into the business, they'll have been off the best part of a year. Well, the business that they're returning to is going to be completely different to the business that they left. And I think that is a real issue. So any support that we can get with regards to upskilling, retraining, supporting, emotional support, as well as kind of physical active support in the working world would be hugely, hugely helpful. I think that people are at the heart of any business, and that's very much our mantra, and we're doing whatever we can even now with no budget. We're training people, we're engaging people, and we're trying our very, very best. And I would urge all businesses to do the same because it has paid, you know, wonderful dividends. I think in terms of ongoing support, I absolutely agree with everything that's been said with the ongoing furlough support, and as we've said before, innovation and investment cannot be ignored. That is what's going to create commercial and economic stability for the longer term, and we can't lose sight of the long term. So we're fortunate enough that we have got the bandwidth, and we're creating the bandwidth to look at strategy for 2021 and beyond. Many businesses, many brewers will just not be in that zone, and you know, British brewing is a real success story of society. And if you look at the explosion of some of the craft breweries and the innovation and the entrepreneurship that's created over however many years, we just do not want that to go. So actually, you know, any form of grant or loans and support with regards to investment and innovation would be hugely appreciated. In addition, we've mentioned sustainability, we've mentioned the support around other factors. I mean, sustainability is very much on our business agenda. Is it at the top? No, because we're so busy firefighting and dealing with the day-to-day challenges that COVID presents. So any form of, again, loans, government support around some of those really essential items. And that's another opportunity for how we can increase employment and create jobs and do all of those things that we as a society should be doing together. So it's more than what currently exists. Money is very much an enabler, but so is time and so are people. And I think that we've got a real opportunity to make the best out of a really bad situation with regards to COVID and how we take it forward. And a lot of it hangs on the budget and what support is going to be offered to our people in our industry and, you know, aviation and many, many more.
How confident are you, Charlene, that the support that you ideally want is going to be forthcoming, specifically for your business?
Specifically for our business, given past records, I'm not confident at all. As I said, you know, there has been a lot of support for pubs, which is great, but the supply chain needs to be focused on. As Rain said, you know, we really do need to focus on that supply chain element. I mentioned before about the £250,000 in terms of stock uplift. Any form of one-off grants that are available for us to offset some of those costs would be wonderful. And actually, what brewers are asking for is no different to what actually exists in other parts of the UK and Europe. So they're already looking at ideas in Northern Ireland, in Scotland, in other European countries, specific hospitality grants. We just want some of that to give ourselves and our, you know, and our colleagues a fighting chance of survival. Because as I've said, we are part of the solution, not the problem, and we just need to be treated as such.
Yeah, thanks, Charlene. And Andy, it's kind of the same question to you, which in terms of the specific things, specific targeted support for your organisation, what would be the things that would make the biggest difference, and how confident are you that they're going to be forthcoming?
Yeah, I think I share Charlene's caution about whether we're likely to get the things that we need. The story for aviation over the last year was that right at the start of the pandemic in March, the Chancellor announced there would be a package of specific support for aviation because you could see how bad it was going to be for the sector. But then they backtracked from that a week or two later. And since then, the only targeted support that we've had beyond, we've used the furlough scheme. The financing measures across the economy aren't really very helpful for airports because of the mix of debt and ownership structures that we already have and it's sort of baked into the business model for airports. So we had some limited support announced in November for our business rates bill, which is capped at £8 million per airport. That gives us about 2/3 of our rates bill. It basically gives more support to smaller airports than bigger ones. So for Heathrow, the biggest airport in the country, it's a tiny fraction of their bill. And obviously that order of support is fairly insignificant in the scale of the loss that I described earlier. You know, we're talking 5 or 10% of the loss that we'll record this year. So I think there is a strong case for looking again at that support. That support was announced in November. The picture looked better in November. We are now in January, February, March, in the harshest point of the pandemic so far. So I think there's a really strong case for more support for aviation and for the other sectors that we talked about, the supply chain, the ones that have been missed out. And I would just echo what Rain said earlier about their attitude and the importance of finishing the job. So much of the support that's been given to the economy and specific sectors has been about buffering through this difficult period so that we can pick up and recover as fast as possible, but being careful not to support, I think these are the media's words rather than the Chancellor's, but zombie jobs that won't exist after this. You look at the sectors we talked about here today and in retail and leisure, I don't think any of those jobs are zombie jobs. They just won't be back on the 1st of May. So I think there's a really strong case to keep supporting that for, I'm talking months, not years, and they'll be right back again. But while the government is still restricting so much of our business activity, so much international travel that matters for us, they're not zombie jobs, they're just being stopped from existing until they're allowed again. So that's what I think our key ask is furlough extension and some continued support for the things like business rates that we can't do anything about on our own, but we can't earn any money while the government's stopping us from trading, essentially.
Yeah, thanks so much. And there's loads of questions coming in and we've only got 4 minutes left, so I'm going to try and get through as many of these as I possibly can. For Rain, on longer term competitiveness, the question here, the UK is trusted and better than most countries for e-commerce domestically and for export. What recommendations are the CBI making to the government to increase e-commerce exports for UK SMEs, favourable policies, building infrastructure, upcoming free ports initiatives? Is there a sort of way that you could talk to that point?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think first I start with one of our recommendations around Invest to Grow is partly to help SMEs adopt digital technologies and the innovation they need, not just to serve their domestic market, but absolutely to export around the world. So I think that has a real benefit. We also think there needs to be almost like make it easier for businesses to know what support is available to them, and also for them to understand what's in new trade deals. So obviously the intention recently has been on our renegotiating our deal with the EU, but the government have also been doing bilateral negotiations at the same time. But businesses, as those new deals come into place, businesses don't always know what it means in terms of access to markets around the world. So we think there really needs to be a sort of one-stop shop where businesses can go to get the information they need, not just about what support there is around innovation, but how do they then get their products to market around the world. So that's something that we really have a focus on. And actually also we think there needs to be an independent office for trade impact to look at the impact of trade policy on businesses of different sizes and in different regions of the UK. Because I think that's another big part actually is, I think we need to have an overall vision for the UK that is looking at, the UK's leadership in the world. We're hosting the G7, we're hosting COP26. But I think we also need to get a really regional flavour around that. I think if you look at the work that Metro Mayors have done in showcasing their regions, we need that for so many different parts of the country. We really need to build on that. So I think that's something that's really important, is how do we sell Yorkshire to the rest of the world? How do we talk about, all the benefits of Manchester, Leeds, Sheffield? There are so many, the UK has so much to offer the world, and we really need to show the diversity, I think, that is here in the UK around all the regions and devolved nations.
If you ever need a volunteer to join the team of people wanting to sell Yorkshire to the rest of the world, count me in. I'm a staunch advocate. I've got one last quick question. I know we've only got literally a couple of minutes left, but I think it's a good place to end. Questions coming from Nicholas Smith, and the spirit of it I wholeheartedly agree with, which is, it seems to me that when lockdown ends, the country will go first on a massive pub crawl and later head off on holiday when the world becomes available to us. How will, this is to Andy and Charlene, how will your businesses cope in the event that there's quite a quick increase in demand? Are you ready for our requirements for a pint and a holiday is the question. Go for it, Charlene. Can she? I don't know if she can hear me. Okay, Charlene, are you ready?
We are ready. We will make sure we are ready. We are ready. So interestingly, and actually it's a really good point, because actually this is one about timing and preparation, because when pubs were set to reopen in July, we got very little notice. But what people don't understand is that actually to fill the supply chain takes time. So for us to brew beer, it takes between 10 and 14 days, and that's excluding getting it onto site. So we actually made the brave decision to brew a lot of beer in advance to be able to make sure that people knew we were available with product to sell in. And actually that worked massively to our advantage, because we were able to take advantage of a huge number of sales. But what we need to know is when pubs are going to be reopened, so that we can brew enough, we can collectively brew enough, get as much beer into the supply chain as possible, and allow people to drink safely in as many places as are possible to be open. Obviously the question is one around commercial viabilities, because many places will not. So whether or not grants are available to restart businesses, I'm not sure. But rest assured, as soon as you want to go to a pub, we will make sure that there is enough beer there for you to drink endlessly.
This is good news for
Before you
all
go
of
to
us.
the airport.
Thank you, Charlene. Andy, how easy is it for your organisation to kind of gear up? I guess, to be fair, with air travel, there's more of a sort of sense of an incline, but are you ready to switch it back on again as and when we need to all have a holiday?
I think it's the same point as Charlene about having as much notice as possible. Yes, airlines are acting in very short notice at the moment it's putting flights off, and they will be ready to put flights on again. My concern is that if we don't have some roadmap out of this that we can plan confidently as businesses, both airports and airlines and travel operators more broadly, we'll have no choice but to make some really difficult decisions that might actually jeopardize our ability to cater for that down the road. But we have to be risk averse when the history of the last year has been sudden, very negative decisions. So yeah. I think my plea would be as much confidence as the government can give us about their intentions, with appropriate caveats, because we all know that the last year has taught us unpredictability is a thing.
We don't know.
But tell us what you'd like to do and we can plan on that basis, rather than telling us at 3 days' notice that suddenly people can travel again, because that's where the real challenge will come if that's what the government chooses to do.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank you to everybody for joining us this morning. In particular, thank you, of course, to Andy and Charlene for making the time, what I know is super hectic. Of course, to Rain as well. It's been, I've learned loads. My best wishes to everybody in the teams. Look after yourselves. My recommendation, the weather is absolutely foul. Put the kettle on, have a biscuit, take a breath, look at your emails. It's been lovely. So my best to everybody at your end, and we will see you back at CBI at 10 this time next week. And it's Dido Harding on Monday. All the best. Bye-bye.